As ancient Rome's powerful and revered all-female priesthood, the Vestal Virgins certainly had little in common with the religious order of women that would rise as they were suppressed, namely nuns. And here we'll take a look at how it all happened. If you've watched my other videos, you know who the Vestal Virgins were and what they meant to Rome. But I'll do a quick recap in case you're new, because you can't really understand the scope or the impact of their forcible disbandment without knowing some of the background. Now, ancient Rome, right from the time of its founding through the centuries of the kingdom and the republic and the empire, it was polytheistic. There were many gods and goddesses. The most important were the 12 deconsentes, which more or less mirrored those 12 Greek Olympian gods that you probably know, but there were also many, many more other gods. These were the earliest gods of our Western culture and civilization, and if you're of a certain heritage, these were the gods of your own ancestors, who, by the way, were free to honor whatever gods they wanted to, thanks to ancient Rome's long-standing policy of religious tolerance. As long as you kept the peace, as long as you respected the customs of Rome and paid your taxes, you were good. Only disruptive religions, or those who sought to undermine other religions, ran into problems. Because ancient Rome recognized the natural balance in the divine, they loved their goddesses as much as their gods, and they respected their priestesses as much as their priests. And the greatest of these priestesses were the Vestal Virgins. This was an all-female priesthood that actually predated the founding of Rome. It was that ancient. We know the Vestal Order was in Alba Longa, for example, which is commonly thought of as Rome's mother city. These priestesses honored the powerful goddess Vesta, goddess of the home and hearth fire. She was worshipped in every home, but also in her temple in the heart of the Roman Forum. The priestesses lived right next door to the temple in the very fancy house of the Vestals. So think underfloor heating and marble walls and private apartments, a courtyard with decorative pools. You can visit the ruins of both the temple and the house of the Vestals today. The primary duty of the Vestal Virgins was to keep the goddess's eternal flame burning in the temple, because it was believed that if this sacred fire went out, Rome would lose the favor of the gods and suffer terrible catastrophes: plague, famine, war, invasion, you name it. Because Vesta was a virgin goddess, her priestesses were expected to be virgins too in order to better commune with her. They therefore took a vow of chastity, dedicating 30 years of their life to the sacred flame and to the Vestal Order. But as much as some people, even today, try to cast the Vestals as some kind of dried-up spinsters, it just wasn't the case. Vestals were selected as children from the best families in Rome. They lived important and interesting lives, and they were very pampered. They ate fine food and had the highest quality medical care. They had front-row seating in the Colosseum and the horse races, and they moved in the highest social circles. They were also free to retire from the order, typically in their later 30s, and if they did, they took their money and their jewelry and their real estate and their well-connected friendships with them. So life was wide open. They could marry if they wanted to. So the Vestals truly were Rome's great priestesses, and the greatest among them was the Vestalis Maxima, which literally translates to the greatest or the highest Vestal. This was the chief Vestal, the head of the order, the high priestess. And do you know who she answered to? Essentially only one person, the Pontifex Maximus, who at the time of the empire was the emperor himself, so everybody answered to him. While we know the names of a number of women who served in this illustrious capacity, I want to talk here about the Vestalis Maxima named Caelia Concordia. And honestly, few women in history have ever had to endure as much trash talk, as much misrepresentation and hypocritical moralizing as poor Caelia. Born into a respected yet plebeian family, Caelia Concordia rose through the ranks of the Vestal Order, completing her novice training and her years of performing temple duties to become the chief priestess in the later part of the 4th century CE. And man, were things changing in Rome at this time. While many, if not most, Romans were still pagan, still honoring the gods of their ancestors and those first gods of Rome, a religion from the Middle East, called Christianity, had been adopted by some key players in Rome, including the emperors. And around the same time that Caelia Concordia becomes Vestalis Maxima, the Emperor Theodosius makes Christianity, and specifically Nicene Christianity, the official state religion. We also start to see increasingly harsh anti-pagan laws enacted around this time. That spirit of religious freedom that had always existed in Rome was rapidly disappearing as Christians insisted their God, and specifically one interpretation of their God, which they had just recently worked out, was the only God. Now, for a while, These anti-pagan laws seem to have been honored more in the breach than in the observance. The fact was there were many important pagans in Rome, soldiers and generals, senators and rich as Midas aristocrats, and the emperor needed these people for the army and for the government, especially in the West, to function. So, who knows? Maybe despite the written laws, Rome could have retained some of its traditional religious coexistence, at least in practice. But some people wouldn't have it, and one of them was a Christian bishop by the name of Ambrosius. Now, Ambrosius, you might know him today as St. Ambrose. He didn't actually begin his career as a member of the clergy. He started out as a politician, and he didn't even bother to get baptized until he was unexpectedly appointed the Bishop of Milan in the 370s. But he goes pretty hardcore early Catholic at this point, and he starts leading the charge against paganism. And the Vestal Virgins, they are smack in the middle of his crosshairs. Because not only were they respected and very independent pagan women, but they served one of Rome's greatest goddesses as consecrated virgins, and that is something that Ambrose could not let stand. And it's no mystery why. It's because the ancient order of the Vestal Virgins was direct competition for the order of Christian virgins, basically early nuns, that his own sister was part of. Indeed, Ambrose had a lot to say about virginity, specifically female virginity. He even wrote a book about it, one that instructed girls how to be good Christian virgins. And of course, if he's going to build up these Christian virgins, he has to tear down the Vestal Virgins. And here's where the trash talk comes in. Now, I must remind you of just how respected the Vestals had been to this point in Rome's long history and how integral they were to Rome's identity and to the state. Rome's founder, Romulus, was born of the Vestal Virgin Maria Silvia and the war god Mars. The Vestal Virgins once saved Julius Caesar's life by granting him sanctuary in the house of the Vestals, and he later had Vesta minted on his gold coins. The great Emperor Augustus, he bragged about supporting the Vestal order, and images of the Vestals were included on his great monuments. The Emperor Vespasian relied on the Vestals, and he gave them great liberty. The Vestals were Rome's heart and soul. But now comes along this kind of politician-turned-churchman who, in an effort to squash the Vestals and to replace them with an order of religious women that he deems more suitable, and by that I mean more voiceless, more impoverished, less important, and of course, serving his God, he basically launches a campaign to strip the Vestal Virgins not just of their status. That isn't far enough. He also has to strip them of their dignity. In his writings, he slanders and mocks the Vestal order. You can feel his contempt for these women leap off the page. He calls them immoral and unchaste, and he ridicules their fixed tenure, saying that whatever lust they're forced to suppress as young women because of their vows, they'll only unleash as old women. He knows that idea and that image, an older woman being sexual, it's easily mocked, and so he leans into the shame and indignity of that. He disparages the lifestyle and the high status of the Vestals, the fine clothing and the fancy food, and how they have special privileges like riding in chariots, all the pomp. He praises the Christian virgins who are content to live and serve in poverty while the Vestals are paid a healthy stipend by the state. And it's this stipend, this payment, that he really despises. He perverts its purpose, and he insinuates that the Vestals are prostitutes who are selling their virginity for a price. They're unchaste, they're wanton, they're dishonorable, they're greedy, and ultimately, they're dried-up old wormbags. Because in the past, just as now, that's how you bring down powerful women. Name-calling, ridiculing their age and their sexuality, and of course comparing them to the type of woman that conforms to your ideology. Octavian's propaganda machine did it to Cleopatra when they spread lies about her sexuality and contrasted her behavior with that of the noble Roman matron. Ambrose certainly did it to the Vestal Virgins. We're still doing it today to powerful women. So, Ambrose attacks the Vestals from all angles. He has to. He has to convince the Christian virgins that they are morally and religiously superior. And he has to do this relentlessly because the Vestal order is very, very ancient. Its roots go back to that beginning of Rome. And also because paganism is still alive and well at this point, very much so. It's the natural state of things in Rome, and he just can't have the Vestal virgins competing with his virgins. He can't have their goddess, any goddess for that matter, competing with his god. So he goes on the offensive and he attacks the Vestal order. And as the high priestess, it's Celia Concordia who bears the brunt of this. Yet from what little remains of her legacy today, we can get a sense of how she might have handled all of this. First, we know that she had a strong will and a mind of her own. She was willing to trust her own judgment and exercise her authority as Vestalis Maxima, even butting heads with the Pontifex Maximus of the day, a respected pagan senator named Symmachus. I think we can also get a sense of her personality by examining what remains of her statue. And here it is. This is a statue of Caelia Concordia, Rome's last great priestess, but what you have to know is that the head isn't her. This is not the face of Caelia Concordia. Those are not her arms or her implements either. This statue was actually found on the Esquiline Hill in the 16th century, but the head and the arms had either been knocked off or broken off. After it was recovered, it was reworked to resemble a muse. So we see this mask and this flute. We also see this head. It's actually the head of Paphos, a god of sexual longing. And if you compare the head on Caelia's statue to this actual statue of Paphos, you can see the resemblance. So whether whoever did this knew what they were doing, or whether it was just a matter of using whatever head was available, which was very common, we'll never know. Nonetheless, a couple things stand out to me about this statue. First, there's a certain posture. It's very confident, and it's also very feminine. We can see the curves of her body, even her belly button. It's quite similar to the statues we see of previous Vestals, including those that you can still see today in the ruins of the House of the Vestals. And although they're not part of the statue anymore, if we turn to an illustration that was made of this statue shortly after it was excavated and before it was reworked, we can see the ribbons that were part of Caelia's Vestal headdress. So she was clearly very proudly displaying her status here. There's also this very large medallion that she's wearing. It was undoubtedly gold and embellished with very expensive jewels. Now, when I first stumbled upon this illustration when I was doing my research for my historical fiction novel about Caelia Concordia, I was really taken with this medallion, and I actually had a jeweler recreate it, and that was really fun. Here's how it likely looked. Red and white gemstones, red for the sacred fire, and white, pearls here, for the purity of the Vestals, arranged in a pagan cross formation. Obviously, it's a very showy piece, and I think combined with Caelia's posture and her Vestal attire and the glimpse that we have into her personality, I think it's pretty safe to say that this Vestal Virgin endured Ambrose's insults and his slanders with the very dignity that he was so desperately trying to strip her of. In fact, I've often wondered whether the confidence and the opulence of this statue, especially that really large medallion, whether it was something of a statement to him and to those like him who were trying to shut down the Vestal Order. And by the way, this is probably what Ambrose looked like. It's a detail of mosaic that was done when he was alive. In any case, the bishop's campaign against paganism and against the Vestal Order in particular paid off in 394 CE, and Theodosius did issue an order that the sacred fire in the temple be extinguished. It's worth stressing, though, that this did not happen without a fight, both on the battlefield and on the floor of the Senate. The pagan senator I mentioned earlier, Symmachus, he and others, they pleaded with the emperor to grant Romans the freedom to honor the gods of their own land and their own ancestors, but it wasn't to be. By that time, the law had been weaponized against the pagans, and the bishops held too much sway over the emperors. So the gods of Rome were banished in their own land, but it didn't stop there, because once you banish or bury something, you need to figure out a way to stop people from digging it up. The law is one way to stop it. Arrogation is another. That's when you claim something like an achievement or a cultural practice as your own when it isn't. It's easy to see with nuns. The style of the headdress and the veil worn by nuns are obviously taken from the Vestal Virgins. Just as novice Vestals had their hair ceremoniously cropped for the veil, so do novice nuns have their hair cropped. The Vestals actually had a fairly beautiful tradition, by the way, of hanging the long locks of their hair on a tree called the capillata tree or the hair tree. Just like the Vestal Virgins used to wear the pagan cross around their necks, the nuns wore Christian crosses. But the similarities are only surface level. Sure, the nuns lived in convents that were reminiscent of the House of the Vestals, but where the Vestals' residence was extravagant and full of servants, cloistered convents were pretty plain, and the nuns did all the work. Not only did the nuns clean the churches, they cooked and cleaned for themselves, and eventually cooked and cleaned for the male clergy too. I promise you that no Vestal Virgin ever labored over a hot oven to make dinner for the male priests, or stayed behind to sweep the kitchen floor while the priests retired to the couches to have a drink and discuss important religious business. That's because the Vestal Order was an integral part of Rome's religious college, and Vestals were entrusted with performing all kinds of religious rites. The Vestalis Maxima in particular was a very powerful woman, religiously and socially. On the other hand, Christianity was a male-dominated religion, and women were expressly forbidden from teaching men or having significant or meaningful religious authority. For example, consider the sacred wafers that the Vestals both made and used for centuries in various religious rites. The nuns continued to make these. They became the communion wafers of the Catholic Church, although only male priests were allowed to use them in a religious ritual. Of course, the Church arrogated many things from the pagan religions, too many to cover in this video, though I will mention the Virgin Mary, who was intended to replace virgin goddesses like Vesta, but certainly not just Vesta. This is the powerful and beautiful Egyptian goddess Isis with her son Horus on her lap, so very obviously the model for the conventional image of Mary and Jesus. But again, there are fundamental differences that remove power and remove agency from female figures. While deities like Vesta and Juno and Isis are powerful goddesses in their own right, that's not the case with Mary. She's often depicted as a younger girl, a teenager, and she has no power of her own, only that which comes to her from her divine male child. In any case, Ambrose ultimately had his way. He was able to get rid of the Vestal Virgins and replace them with an order of religious women that was more agreeable to him in the church. And the way he did it, by misrepresenting the Vestal service, by disparaging their sexuality, it certainly didn't do women any favors. And suppressing religious freedom by criminalizing other faiths, that certainly didn't do the Western world any favors as it moved into the Dark Ages. And yes, compared to the freedom of religion and the freedom of thought and ideas and scientific inquiry that existed in earlier times before the Church and its particular ideas of the supernatural gained nearly absolute power, the years of the Middle Ages do seem pretty dark. Yet as much as I'm ragging on Ambrose here, it certainly wasn't just him or the other male bishops who slandered the Vestal Order or worked to quash religious freedoms. There were many women at their side helping to make it happen. The net result was to reduce the status of women in religious life while simultaneously robbing the Western world of the comfort and the beauty and the dignity of Rome's great goddesses. But here's the thing about something called an eternal flame. It doesn't really ever go out. Neither does the force or the draw of custom. And I think that's why we're seeing such a resurgence these days of paganism in various places and in its many, many forms. Many people are turning back to the gods of their ancestors, and many are just exploring to see what feels right to them. And if you feel a sense of reverence or comfort when you look into the flame of a candle, maybe you're seeing a flicker of Vesta yourself. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to learn more about Celia Concordia, she really is amazing. I have a really cool page on my website at allthingsvesta.com dedicated just to her. I'll put the link in the description. You can also check out my novel called Celia Concordia, The Last Vestal Virgin of Rome, if you're so inclined. It's my 7th novel about the Vestal Virgins. Thank you for watching.